Aurelia Thornwick stared at the eviction notice clutched in her trembling hands. 72 hours. That's all she had before they would be thrown onto the streets of Portland. 6-year-old Orion slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that his world was about to crumble. Her phone buzzed with another automated message from Child Protective Services. The hearing was scheduled for Friday. Without stable housing, they would take Orion away from her. She had worked double shifts at the art restoration studio for months, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. She scrolled through her contacts, looking for her friend Maya's number. Maya had mentioned her cousin might have a spare room. It was a long shot, but desperation made even impossible options seem reasonable. Her fingers shook as she typed the message. The numbers blurred together on the cracked screen. She had been putting off replacing the phone for weeks, choosing between groceries and a new device. Groceries always won. Maya, I don't know what to do anymore. They're going to take Orion from me. I have 3 days to find a place to live, or CPS will put him in foster care. I've failed him as a mother. I've failed at everything. Please tell me your cousin still has that room available. I can pay rent as soon as I get my next commission check. I'm begging you. She hit send without double-checking the number. Across town, in a sleek downtown penthouse, Dorian Ravencrest was reviewing acquisition reports when his personal phone chimed. He glanced at the unknown number, ready to delete what was probably another spam message. Then he read the words. The coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. Thornwick. After 10 years of searching, monitoring, hoping for any trace of Valentina's daughter, her name had appeared in his inbox by accident. He read the message 3 times, his chest tightening with each word. The girl he had once known as a defiant teenager with paint-stained fingers was now a struggling mother facing the same kind of loss that had destroyed him a decade ago. Dorian remembered the last time he had seen Aurelia. She was 17, screaming at him in the hospital corridor after Valentina's funeral, blaming him for her mother's death. Maximilian Devereux had poisoned her against him, convincing her that Dorian's business decisions had driven Valentina to suicide. The truth was far more sinister, but he had no proof then. He still didn't have enough proof now. His phone rang. Marcus Webb, his head of security. Sir, we've traced that message. It was meant for Amaya Rodriguez, but the sender transposed 2 digits. Should I handle this quietly? Dorian stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker below. Somewhere out there, Aurelia was facing the same nightmare he had lived through when Maximilian seized control of their company and destroyed everything Dorian had built with Valentina. No, I'll handle this personally. Sir, given your history with the Thornwick family, perhaps we should maintain distance. Maximilian Devereux still has considerable influence in this city. Dorian's jaw clenched. Maximilian had spent 10 years building his empire on the foundation of Valentina's death, using her innovative art authentication techniques to corner the market while eliminating anyone who questioned the circumstances of her demise. Devereux thinks I'm broken. He thinks I disappeared because I was guilty. Let him keep thinking that while I get close to the one person who might help me expose what really happened that night. And if she recognizes you? Dorian pulled up the social media photos Marcus had already compiled. Aurelia looked nothing like the angry teenager from his memories. Stress had carved hollow shadows under her eyes, and exhaustion weighed down her shoulders. More importantly, she had been too consumed with grief to pay attention to business details back then. The chances of her connecting the helpful stranger Dorian Ravencrest to the monster Maximilian had painted him to be were minimal. She won't. I've changed, and so has she. Besides, she needs help, and I need answers. Valentina hid something before she died, something that proves Maximilian killed her. If Aurelia inherited any of her mother's belongings, there might be evidence. Dorian walked to his safe and removed a folder he hadn't opened in months. Inside were photographs of Valentina's last art authentication project, taken just days before her death. She had been agitated, claiming she had discovered something that would destroy Maximilian's reputation forever. Then she was found dead in her studio, apparently having taken an overdose of sleeping pills. Find out everything about Aurelia's situation. I want to know about the eviction, the CPS case, her work, her debts, everything. And Marcus? I want options for helping her that won't raise suspicions. After ending the call, Dorian typed a response to the mistaken message. I think you sent this to the wrong number, but I couldn't ignore someone in such distress. I may be able to help with your housing situation. Would you be willing to meet? He stared at the message for several minutes before sending it. 10 years of planning, investigating, and waiting had led to this moment. Valentina's killer was about to face justice, but first, Dorian had to save her daughter. Aurelia stared at the response message, her heart pounding. A complete stranger offering help seemed too good to be true, which meant it probably was. She had learned not to trust easy solutions. Her phone rang before she could decide whether to respond. Unknown number. Hello. This is Dorian. I sent you the text message a few minutes ago. I hope you don't mind that I called. His voice was calm, professional, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Aurelia immediately felt self-conscious about her situation. I'm sorry, I think I sent that message to the wrong person. You don't need to get involved in my problems. Perhaps not, but I'd like to help anyway. I work in real estate investment, and I have properties that sit empty while I renovate them. You mentioned needing a place quickly. Aurelia closed her eyes. Every instinct screamed that this was a mistake, but Orion's breathing from the next room reminded her that she was out of options. What would you want in return? Nothing immediately. We can discuss rent arrangements once you're stable. I'm more interested in helping someone who clearly loves her child. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had become so accustomed to people wanting something from her that genuine kindness felt foreign. I don't understand why you do this for a stranger. Dorian paused, and she could hear him moving around on the other end of the line. Let's just say I understand what it's like to lose everything. 12 years earlier, Dorian had walked into Valentina Thornwick's art authentication lab with a business proposal that would change both their lives. She was 32 then, recently divorced, with a teenage daughter who spent more time arguing with her than listening. Her reputation for detecting art forgeries was legendary in the Pacific Northwest, but she was struggling to expand beyond regional clients. Dorian had been 26, fresh out of business school, with more ambition than capital. He had studied her work for months, recognizing that her authentication techniques could revolutionize the art investment market if properly scaled. Miss Thornwick, I think we can build something extraordinary together. Valentina had looked up from the Renaissance painting she was examining, her green eyes sharp with skepticism, those same eyes that Aurelia had inherited. Young man, I've heard every business proposal imaginable. What makes you think yours is different? Because I'm not trying to buy your expertise. I want to partner with it. That conversation had lasted 6 hours. By the end, they had outlined a business plan that would make them both wealthy while preserving the integrity of art authentication. Valentina would handle the technical aspects, while Dorian managed expansion and client development. What neither of them anticipated was Maximilian Devereux. Valentina's ex-husband had monitored their growing success with increasing resentment. During their divorce, he had been entitled to half of her assets, but her authentication business had been worth relatively little then. Watching her build a multi-million-dollar company with a younger partner triggered something vicious in him. Maximilian began spreading rumors about Dorian's background, questioning his credentials, suggesting that he was manipulating Valentina for financial gain. When rumors failed to damage their partnership, he escalated to legal challenges, frivolous lawsuits, and regulatory complaints. The breaking point came when Valentina discovered that Maximilian had been feeding inside information about their client list to competitors. She had been working late in her lab, cross-referencing authentication requests with market activity, when she noticed the pattern. Dorian remembered that phone call at 2 in the morning. He's been sabotaging us for months. Every major piece we authenticate gets copied and sold before our clients can bring it to market. Maximilian has been using his connections to warn forgers about our techniques. Do you have proof? I'm working on it. But Dorian, there's something else. I think he's been forging authentication certificates using my signature. If that's true, it means dozens of fake pieces are circulating with my seal of approval. That had been their last conversation. 3 days later, Valentina was found dead in her studio. The police ruled it suicide, noting that she had been under significant stress due to business pressures. Maximilian, as her ex-husband and father of her child, inherited control of her authentication techniques and client database. Within a week, he had accused Dorian of financial misconduct and emotional manipulation, claiming that Dorian's aggressive business tactics had driven Valentina to take her own life. Without Valentina to defend him, and with Maximilian's connections throughout the legal and business communities, Dorian found himself facing criminal charges that could have destroyed his future. He had been forced to liquidate his assets to pay legal fees, eventually accepting a settlement that required him to stay away from the art authentication business and the Thornwick family. Maximilian had effectively erased him from Valentina's life and driven him out of the industry they had built together. But Dorian had spent the last 10 years rebuilding his wealth and influence, always watching for an opportunity to expose what Maximilian had done. He had hired private investigators, forensic accountants, and technology experts to gather evidence. But Maximilian had covered his tracks well. Now Valentina's daughter needed help, and Dorian finally had a reason to get close to the family again. "Mr. Dorian?" Aurelia's voice brought him back to the present. "I'm here. When can we meet to discuss the housing arrangement?" The coffee shop near the art restoration studio buzzed with the usual morning crowd of students and office workers. Aurelia sat in the corner booth, nervously checking her phone every few seconds. Meeting a stranger who had offered to solve her housing crisis felt surreal and potentially dangerous, but she had run out of safer options. A man in his mid-30s approached her table. Tall, well-dressed without being flashy, with dark hair and the kind of calm confidence that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray that seemed to assess everything around him. "Aurelia Thornwick." She nodded, studying his face for any signs of recognition or threat. Nothing about him seemed familiar, which was both reassuring and unsettling. Dorian Ravencrest. He extended his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." His handshake was firm but not aggressive. She noticed his watch was expensive but not ostentatious, and his shoes were well-made leather that had been properly maintained. Everything about him suggested wealth, but the subtle kind that came from old money rather than new. "I have to ask why you're doing this. People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return." Dorian smiled, and for a moment something flickered in his expression that reminded her of someone, though she couldn't place who. "I believe in second chances. Sometimes life puts obstacles in our path that have nothing to do with our choices or character." "That's a nice philosophy, but it doesn't explain why you're personally involved in helping someone you've never met." He signaled the waitress for coffee before answering. Aurelia noticed that he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I knew your mother." The words hit her like a physical blow. Aurelia's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "That's impossible. My mother died 10 years ago, and I would remember you. You were dealing with grief. I worked with Valentina briefly, and I've always regretted that I couldn't do more to help during that difficult period." Aurelia's mind raced through her memories of the months before and after her mother's death. There had been so many business associates, lawyers, and investigators that the faces had blurred together. She had been 17, angry at the world, and more focused on blaming everyone around her than paying attention to specific individuals. "What kind of work did you do with her?" "Business consulting. Your mother was brilliant at art authentication, but she needed help with the commercial aspects of expanding her practice." The explanation felt plausible. Valentina had always been more interested in the technical challenges of her work than the business details. Aurelia remembered her mother complaining about contracts, client management, and financial planning. "My stepfather handled most of her business affairs after she died." "Maximilian Devereux. Maybe you worked with him instead." Dorian's expression didn't change, but Aurelia caught a slight tension in his jaw when she mentioned Maximilian's name. "I met him, yes. He was very protective of your mother's legacy." Something in his tone suggested that protection might not have been entirely positive, but Aurelia was too focused on her immediate crisis to analyze subtle implications. "So this is charity? You're helping me because you feel guilty about not doing more for my mother." "Partly, but I also think you might be able to help me with something I'm working on." Finally, the real reason. Aurelia felt a mix of relief and disappointment. At least now she understood what he wanted from her. "What kind of help?" "I'm putting together an investment portfolio focused on art authentication and restoration services. Your background in restoration, combined with your mother's reputation in authentication, makes you exactly the kind of professional I need to consult with." "I restore paintings. I don't authenticate them. Those are completely different skill sets. But you understand the technical aspects of how art deteriorates and how it's repaired. That knowledge is valuable when assessing whether a piece is worth investing in." Dorian leaned forward slightly, and Aurelia noticed that he seemed genuinely interested in her expertise rather than just trying to manipulate her into accepting his help. I have properties in Portland that I'm renovating for eventual sale. One of them is a converted warehouse in the Pearl District. It's been empty for 6 months while I decide what to do with it. You and your son could stay there temporarily while I evaluate whether to turn it into loft apartments or commercial space. What would you want me to do in return? Spend a few hours each week reviewing potential art investments with me. Look at pieces I'm considering purchasing. Give me your professional opinion about their condition and restoration potential. The arrangement sounded too good to be true, but Aurelia couldn't identify any obvious traps. She would have stable housing for herself and Orion, plus an opportunity to earn consulting fees that could help her build financial stability. Can I see the place before I commit to anything? Of course. Are you available this afternoon? Aurelia nodded, then hesitated. Mr. Ravencrest, I need you to understand that I have a son to protect. If this arrangement isn't exactly what you're presenting it to be, I'll involve the police. I would expect nothing less from Valentina's daughter. The warehouse space was larger than Aurelia's entire previous apartment. Exposed brick walls, industrial windows, and polished concrete floors created an atmosphere that was both stark and welcoming. Orion had claimed the loft area as his bedroom within minutes of their arrival, declaring it the coolest place he had ever lived. The heating system is new, and I've had the electrical updated to handle modern appliances, Dorian explained as he showed her the kitchen area. There's no formal lease agreement. Stay as long as you need to get back on your feet. Aurelia watched him interact with Orion, who was bouncing between asking questions about the building's history and demonstrating his ability to slide across the polished floors in his socks. Most adults tolerated children rather than engaging with them, but Dorian seemed genuinely interested in Orion's chatter about school and his drawings. Are you married? Do you have kids? Orion asked with the direct curiosity that made most adults uncomfortable. No to both questions. I travel too much for work to be fair to a family. That's sad. Everyone should have a family. Dorian glanced at Aurelia, something unreadable flickering in his expression. You're probably right about that. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Aurelia had settled into a routine that felt more stable than anything she had experienced since her mother's death. Orion's grades were improving now that he wasn't changing schools every few months, and she had been able to take on larger restoration projects without worrying about losing their housing. Dorian stopped by the warehouse several evenings each week, ostensibly to discuss potential art investments, but increasingly just to check on them. He brought dinner more often than not, claiming that he was in the neighborhood anyway. Aurelia suspected he was making excuses to spend time with them, but she found herself looking forward to his visits. Mom, do you think Dorian likes you? Orion asked one evening after Dorian had left. What do you mean? He looks at you the way Dad looked at Mom in that movie we watched. You know, before the aliens attacked. Aurelia laughed despite herself. I think he's just being kind to us because he knew my mother. Maybe, but he fixed my bike chain today, and he didn't have to do that. The observation was accurate. Dorian had spent an hour in the warehouse courtyard, teaching Orion how to maintain his bicycle while Aurelia worked on a damaged portrait from the 1800s. She had watched them through the window, noticing how patient Dorian was with Orion's questions and how naturally he seemed to fall into a mentoring role. What troubled her was how much she enjoyed having another adult to share parenting responsibilities with, even temporarily. She had been independent for so long that relying on someone else felt both wonderful and terrifying. That night, after Orion was asleep, Dorian returned with a bottle of wine and a folder of photographs. I wanted to show you some pieces I'm considering for acquisition. Your opinion would be valuable. They spread the photographs across her work table, and Aurelia examined each image carefully. The paintings were all from the late Renaissance period, technically proficient but not masterworks. These are solid investments, but nothing extraordinary. Good craftsmanship, authentic period materials, reasonable condition. Why these specific pieces? They're part of an estate sale. The previous owner was a private collector who focused on works that had been authenticated by smaller, regional experts rather than major auction houses. Aurelia nodded, understanding the strategy. Pieces authenticated by lesser-known experts often sold for significantly less than their actual value, creating opportunities for knowledgeable investors. Do you have authentication certificates for any of these? Dorian shuffled through the folder, and handed her several documents. As she examined them, her breath caught. The authentication style, the technical language, even the paper quality looked familiar. This one was authenticated by my mother. She held up a certificate bearing Valentina's signature and official seal. The painting was a minor work by a student of Caravaggio, dated to 1612. I thought you might recognize her work. That's actually why I wanted your opinion on these pieces. Aurelia studied the certificate more carefully. Something felt wrong about it, though she couldn't immediately identify what was bothering her. When was this authentication completed? According to the paperwork, about 6 months before your mother died. That's impossible. Dorian leaned forward, his attention sharpening. Why? My mother stopped accepting new authentication projects 9 months before she died. She was too focused on some research project to take on additional work. I remember because we argued about money constantly during that period. Are you certain about the timeline? Aurelia examined the certificate again, this time focusing on details rather than overall appearance. The signature looked correct, but the paper seemed newer than it should be for a document that was over 10 years old. Mr. Ravencrest, where exactly did you get these pieces? For the first time since she had met him, Dorian hesitated before answering. From a private dealer who specializes in estate acquisitions. Why do you ask? Because I think this authentication certificate is a forgery. The forged authentication certificate lay between them on the table like an accusation. Aurelia's hands trembled as she held it up to the light, examining the watermark and paper quality with the expertise her mother had taught her years ago. This isn't just a forgery, Mr. Ravencrest. Someone has been systematically reproducing my mother's authentication style and her official seals. Do you understand what that means? Dorian's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. It means someone has been committing fraud using your mother's reputation. It means someone killed her to steal her techniques and has been profiting from her death for 10 years. The words hung in the air between them. Aurelia watched Dorian's reaction carefully, noting how his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. Aurelia, there's something I need to tell you about why I really wanted to help you. Don't. She stood up abruptly, backing away from the table. Whatever you're about to say, I need to think about this certificate first. Someone has been using my mother's name to authenticate fake pieces, and you just happened to show up with examples of their work right after I needed help. It's not what you think. Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been investigating my mother's death and using me to get information. Dorian stood slowly, his movements careful as if he were approaching a frightened animal. I have been investigating your mother's death, but not for the reasons you're assuming. Aurelia's mind raced through everything that had happened since that first text message. The convenient timing of his help, his knowledge of her mother's work, his interest in art authentication, the way he had maneuvered himself into their lives. Who are you really? My name is Dorian Ravencrest. That part has always been true. But I wasn't just a business consultant who worked with your mother. I was her partner. The room seemed to tilt around her. Aurelia gripped the edge of her work table, trying to process what he was telling her. Partner in what sense? Business partner. We built the authentication company together. I handled the commercial expansion while she managed the technical aspects. Memory fragments began clicking into place. A younger man with the same gray eyes who had attended her mother's funeral. Someone who had tried to approach her at the hospital but had been turned away by Maximilian. Heated arguments between her mother and stepfather about business decisions and partnership agreements. I remember you. Dorian's expression shifted to something that looked like relief mixed with dread. You were 17. You were angry at everyone, including me. I was angry at you because Maximilian told me you drove her to suicide. The words came out as an accusation. He said you pressured her to expand too quickly, that you made business decisions that put her reputation at risk, that you treated her like an employee instead of a partner. Maximilian lied to you, did he? Because from what I remember, my mother was under tremendous stress in the months before she died. She was working longer hours, arguing with people on the phone constantly, and she seemed terrified of something. If you were her business partner, then you were part of whatever was destroying her. Dorian moved toward her, and she stepped back instinctively. Aurelia, your mother didn't commit suicide. She was murdered. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. That's impossible. The police investigated. They found no evidence of foul play. The police found exactly what Maximilian wanted them to find. Your mother had discovered that he was selling forged authentication certificates using her signature and seal. She was gathering evidence to expose him when she died. You're lying. But even as she said it, pieces of a puzzle she had never fully understood began falling into place. Maximilian's immediate control over her mother's business assets. The way he had discouraged her from asking questions about the circumstances of Valentina's death. His insistence that Dorian was dangerous and should be avoided at all costs. The night before she died, your mother called me. She said she had proof that Maximilian was destroying her reputation and stealing from her clients. She was going to turn everything over to the authorities the next morning. Aurelia pressed her hands against her temples, trying to organize the conflicting information and memories. If that's true, why didn't you go to the police after she died? I tried, but Maximilian had prepared for that possibility. He had documentation suggesting that I was the one stealing from the company, that I had been pressuring your mother to ignore ethical standards for the sake of profit. Without Valentina alive to contradict his story, it looked like I had driven my partner to suicide and then tried to cover my tracks by blaming her innocent ex-husband. So you disappeared. I was forced to disappear. Maximilian made it clear that if I continued to pursue the matter, he would ensure that I faced criminal charges. I was 28 years old with no political connections and limited resources. He had influential friends throughout the legal system and enough money to destroy me in court. Aurelia sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what Dorian was telling her. Why should I believe you instead of him? Because I spent 10 years building the resources and connections necessary to prove what really happened. Because I've been waiting for an opportunity to expose Maximilian without putting you and Orion at risk. And because that forged certificate you just identified is part of the evidence I need to destroy him. She looked at the authentication documents scattered across her work table. If Dorian was telling the truth, then the man who had raised her for the last 10 years was responsible for her mother's death. If he was lying, then she had allowed a manipulative stranger into her life and put her son in danger. I need time to think about this. I understand. But Aurelia, there's something else you need to know. Maximilian doesn't know that I'm back in Portland, and he certainly doesn't know that I've been in contact with you. If he finds out, he'll view you as a threat. A threat to what? To the empire he built on your mother's grave. The casual brutality of the phrase made her flinch. Whatever the truth was about her mother's death, Dorian clearly believed that Maximilian was responsible, and his desire for revenge was unmistakable. I want you to leave. Aurelia, please. I said leave. I need to process this information without you here influencing my thoughts. Dorian nodded reluctantly and moved toward the door, then turned back. For what it's worth, I genuinely care about you and Orion. Whatever happens between us regarding your mother's death, that part has always been real. After he left, Aurelia sat alone in the warehouse, staring at the forged authentication certificate and trying to decide whom to trust. Outside, Portland's evening traffic hummed past, and she could hear Orion moving around in his loft bedroom, completely unaware that his world might be about to change again. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Maximilian's contact information. For 10 years, he had been the closest thing to a father she had known. He had paid for her education, helped her get established in her career, and checked in with her regularly even after she moved out on her own. But he had also discouraged her from asking questions about her mother's work, steered her away from the art authentication business, and always changed the subject when she mentioned wanting to understand more about Valentina's final months. The phone rang twice before he answered. Aurelia, darling, how are you and that beautiful boy? I'm fine, Maximilian. I wanted to ask you about something. Of course. What can I help you with? Do you remember a man named Dorian Ravencrest? He says he worked with my mother. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Maximilian, are you there? Where did you hear that name? His voice had changed completely, taking on a cold edge she had never heard before. He contacted me about some business matters. Why? Is there something I should know about him? Aurelia, listen to me very carefully. Dorian Ravencrest is a dangerous man who destroyed your mother's life and drove her to suicide. If he has contacted you, you need to call the police immediately. Maximilian's reaction to Dorian's name had been unmistakable. The warmth in his voice had vanished instantly, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. Aurelia ended the call with promises to stay away from Dorian, But her stepfather's warning had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of reassuring her, it made her question everything she thought she knew about her mother's death. She waited until she heard Orion's breathing settle into the deep rhythm of sleep, then quietly made her way to the storage area where she kept the few belongings that had survived their multiple moves over the years. Buried beneath winter clothes and old school projects was a box she hadn't opened since moving out of Maximilian's house at 18. Inside were the personal items Maximilian had given her from her mother's studio. Photos, a few pieces of jewelry, some books on art history, and a leather portfolio containing her mother's personal notes and sketches. Aurelia had avoided looking through these items for years, finding the memories too painful to confront. Now she spread everything across her work table, searching for anything that might support or contradict Dorian's claims about her mother's final months. The photos showed Valentina in her laboratory, examining paintings under specialized lighting, making detailed notes about brush techniques and pigment analysis. In several pictures, she was smiling at someone behind the camera. The expression was relaxed and genuine, suggesting she was comfortable with whoever was taking the photographs. Aurelia found herself studying her mother's face for signs of the stress and fear that Dorian claimed had characterized her final months. In the earlier photos, Valentina looked confident and engaged with her work. But in the later images, her smile seemed forced, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights. The leather portfolio contained technical notes that were largely incomprehensible to someone without expertise in chemical analysis and historical art techniques. But scattered among the scientific observations were personal comments that painted a different picture of Valentina's final months than the official narrative Aurelia had been told. One entry, dated 6 weeks before her death, read, "M continues to pressure me to rush authentications for his private clients. Claims it's just business efficiency, but I'm concerned about compromising accuracy for speed." Several pieces this month have raised questions that deserve more thorough investigation. Another note, from 3 weeks later, found discrepancies in certificates I supposedly signed last month. Paper stock is wrong, and the authentication numbers don't match my records. Someone is forging my work. Aurelia's hands shook as she read the final entries. Confirmed today that M has been selling fake certificates using my signature. Don't know how many pieces are affected, but this could destroy everything I've built. Need to gather evidence before confronting him. D says we can expose M together, but I'm terrified of what he might do if he discovers we know. He's been asking too many questions about my security protocols and client database access. The last entry was dated 2 days before Valentina's death. Meeting with D tomorrow to turn over everything to authorities. Can't let him destroy any more artists' reputations or steal from any more collectors. Whatever happens, at least they will know the truth someday. Aurelia read the entries 3 times, her understanding of her mother's death shifting with each repetition. The woman described in these notes wasn't someone contemplating suicide. She was someone fighting to protect her professional integrity and preparing to expose a serious crime. She picked up her phone and called Dorian, not caring that it was nearly midnight. "Aurelia? What's wrong? I found my mother's notes from before she died. You were telling the truth about Maximilian. Are you safe? Where are you?" "I'm at the warehouse." "Dorian, there's something else. My mother wrote that she was meeting with someone called D to turn evidence over to the authorities. That was you, wasn't it?" "Yes. We were supposed to meet the morning after she died." "What happened to the evidence she was gathering?" Maximilian claimed there was no evidence. He said the police searched her studio thoroughly and found nothing that suggested fraud or forgery. Her computer had been wiped clean, and all her business files were missing. Aurelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the warehouse's drafty windows. He destroyed everything. Not everything. Your mother was smarter than he realized. She wouldn't have trusted him with access to her most sensitive files, and she was too careful to keep everything in one location. "What do you mean?" "Aurelia, your mother spent 30 years building her reputation in art authentication. She would have had backup systems, hidden storage, contingency plans. Somewhere, there's evidence that proves what Maximilian did. If that's true, why haven't you found it in 10 years? "Because I haven't had access to her personal belongings or her private workspace. Maximilian controlled everything after her death, and he made sure I couldn't get close enough to search for hidden evidence." Aurelia looked around the warehouse, suddenly aware of how isolated she was. If Maximilian had killed her mother to protect his criminal enterprise, what would he do to prevent her from exposing him now? Dorian, I'm scared. Lock the doors and don't let anyone in except me. I'm coming over. Wait, there's something else I need to understand. If you and my mother were business partners, why did I only remember you vaguely from the funeral? Wouldn't I have met you before? Your mother kept her personal and professional lives very separate. She was concerned that Maximilian was becoming jealous of our business success, so she avoided bringing me around the house. Most of our meetings took place at her laboratory or in my office. The explanation made sense, but it also raised another question that made Aurelia's stomach clench with anxiety. Were you and my mother romantically involved? The long pause before Dorian answered told her everything she needed to know. We were attracted to each other, but we never acted on it while she was married to Maximilian. After her divorce, we discussed the possibility of becoming more than business partners, but we wanted to wait until the custody arrangements with you were settled before making any major changes to her personal life. Aurelia closed her eyes, trying to process this new information. Her mother had been planning a future with Dorian, which gave him even more reason to want justice for her death. But it also meant that everything Maximilian had told her about Dorian being a manipulative business partner was a lie designed to keep her away from someone who might expose the truth. Aurelia, are you still there? I'm here. I just need to understand something else. When you offered to help me, was it because you cared about me personally, or because you saw an opportunity to get revenge against Maximilian? Both. I genuinely care about you and Orion, but I won't lie and say that justice for your mother wasn't part of my motivation. At least he was being honest now. Aurelia appreciated that more than false reassurances about his pure intentions. How much danger am I in? That depends on whether Maximilian believes you're a threat to him. As long as he thinks you accept the suicide narrative and have no interest in investigating your mother's death, you should be safe. But I just called him and asked about you. Won't that make him suspicious? Probably. Which is why I'm coming over and why we need to decide what to do next. Aurelia heard a car door slam outside the warehouse. For a moment, panic flooded through her as she imagined Maximilian arriving to eliminate another threat to his secret. Then she heard Dorian's voice calling her name. She unlocked the door and let him in, noting that he looked as shaken as she felt. Show me your mother's notes. Dorian examined Valentina's personal notes with the intensity of someone reading a map to buried treasure. His fingers traced the handwritten entries, and Aurelia watched his expression shift from hope to determination to something that looked dangerously close to rage. She documented everything. Every suspicious transaction, every forged certificate, every conversation where Maximilian pressured her to compromise her standards. He looked up at Aurelia. This is exactly what we need to destroy him, but we need the physical evidence to support these claims. What kind of physical evidence? The forged certificates themselves, financial records showing the payments for fraudulent authentications, communication between Maximilian and his clients about the fake pieces. Your mother mentioned keeping copies of everything, but she wouldn't have stored them anywhere Maximilian could access. Aurelia thought about her mother's habits and personality. Valentina had been methodical about everything, from organizing her art supplies to maintaining detailed records of every project. If she had been gathering evidence against Maximilian, she would have hidden it somewhere secure but accessible. Her storage unit. Dorian looked up sharply. What storage unit? My mother rented a climate-controlled storage space for artwork that was too valuable to keep in her studio. Maximilian told me it was empty when he closed it after her death, but what if he lied about that too? Do you have access to it? I don't know. I never thought to check whether my name was on the rental agreement. Dorian was already pulling out his phone. Give me the address. I can have someone check the records tonight. Aurelia hesitated. Once she gave him that information, there would be no going back. If they found evidence that confirmed Maximilian's guilt, her entire understanding of the last 10 years would be shattered. The man who had raised her, paid for her education, and helped her through countless difficulties would be revealed as her mother's killer. Aurelia, I know this is overwhelming, but your mother died trying to protect other people from Maximilian's fraud. Don't you think she deserves justice? Before she could answer, her phone rang. Maximilian's name appeared on the screen. Don't answer it, Dorian warned. If I don't, he'll get suspicious. I'll make it quick. She accepted the call, putting it on speaker so Dorian could hear. Hello, Maximilian. Darling, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. I'm concerned that Dorian Ravencrest might try to contact you again. He's very good at manipulating people, especially vulnerable women. Aurelia met Dorian's eyes across the table. I appreciate your concern, but I can take care of myself. Of course you can. But humor an old man who loves you like a daughter. Where are you staying these days? I realize we haven't talked about your living situation since you moved out of your last apartment. The question sounded casual, but something in Maximilian's tone made Aurelia's skin crawl. She had never told him about the eviction or her housing crisis. I'm staying with a friend temporarily. Which friend? You know I worry about you and Orion. Dorian was shaking his head frantically, making cutting motions across his throat. Just someone I met through work. Nothing permanent. Well, I hope this friend is trustworthy. There are so many dangerous people in the world these days. After she ended the call, Dorian began pacing around the warehouse like a caged animal. He knows. I don't know how, but he knows you're not staying where you're supposed to be. You're being paranoid. Am I? Think about what you just told me. Your mother documented evidence of Maximilian's crimes, planned to turn him in to the authorities, and died under suspicious circumstances the night before she was supposed to meet with me. Now, 10 years later, her daughter is asking questions about me and living in an undisclosed location. How do you think he's going to react to that? Aurelia felt a chill of recognition. Maximilian had always been protective of her, but his questions tonight had felt different. More like an interrogation than concern. We need to get that storage unit information and find your mother's evidence before he realizes what we're doing. Dorian made several phone calls while Aurelia tried to remember everything she could about her mother's storage habits. Valentina had been secretive about the unit, claiming it contained valuable pieces that required special security measures. She had always gone alone to retrieve or store items, never taking Aurelia with her. My contact at the storage facility says your name is listed as an authorized user on the account. It was never closed after your mother's death, and the rental fees have been paid automatically from an account that Maximilian doesn't control. That's impossible. How could rental payments continue for 10 years without someone noticing? Your mother set up an automatic payment system through a separate bank account. She was planning for the possibility that something might happen to her. The implications of that planning sent another wave of fear through Aurelia. Her mother had anticipated that she might be killed and had taken steps to preserve evidence even after her death. We should go there now. Dorian checked his watch. It's almost 2 in the morning. The facility won't be accessible until business hours. Can't your contacts get us in sooner? Not without raising suspicions that might get back to Maximilian. We need to be careful about how we handle this. As if summoned by their conversation about caution, Aurelia heard a car engine outside the warehouse. She moved to the window and peered through the industrial blinds. A dark sedan was parked across the street, its engine running but its lights off. Dorian. He joined her at the window, and she watched his expression harden as he studied the vehicle. How long has that car been there? I don't know. I just noticed it. We need to leave. Now, what about Orion? I can't just abandon him here. Go wake him up. Tell him we're taking a late-night adventure. Don't let him know you're scared. Aurelia climbed to the loft area where Orion was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his safe world was about to be shattered again. She shook him gently awake. Hey, sweetheart. We need to take a trip. Now? It's still dark outside. I know, but Dorian needs our help with something important. Can you get dressed quickly? Orion rubbed his eyes and sat up, instantly alert in the way that children who had experienced instability learned to be. Are we in trouble again? The question broke her heart. At 6 years old, Orion had already learned to associate sudden departures with danger. No, baby. We're helping a friend. Everything is going to be okay. She helped him gather a few essential items while listening to Dorian moving around downstairs. When they came down from the loft, he was standing by the back exit with a duffel bag and a grim expression. There's a second car now. We're being watched from both directions. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Aurelia, I spent 10 years learning to recognize surveillance. Trust me on this. She looked around the warehouse that had been their home for only a few weeks, but it felt like the first stable place they had found in years. Now they were running again, but this time the threat wasn't financial instability or bureaucratic complications. This time, someone wanted to hurt them. Where can we go? I have a cabin outside the city. It's isolated and secure. We can regroup there and figure out our next move. Dorian led them through the warehouse to a service exit that opened onto an alley behind the building. His car was parked there, positioned for a quick escape. As they loaded into the vehicle, Aurelia caught a glimpse of movement near the street-side entrance of the warehouse. They're going inside. Dorian started the engine and pulled out of the alley without turning on the headlights, which means they'll discover we're gone within minutes. We need to get as far away from here as possible before they realize we've left. As they drove through Portland's empty streets, Orion fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the sudden disruption to his routine. Aurelia watched him in the rearview mirror, trying to process how quickly their situation had deteriorated. How did Maximilian find us so fast? He's had 10 years to build a network of contacts and resources. If he decided you were a threat, he would have mobilized everything available to locate you. What does he want? Dorian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. To eliminate the threat you represent. Your mother's notes prove that she was investigating his crimes. If those notes become public, along with whatever evidence she hid in that storage unit, his entire empire collapses. But I'm his stepdaughter. He raised me. Surely he wouldn't actually hurt me. Aurelia, he killed the woman he was married to. What makes you think family relationships mean anything to him? The brutal logic of that statement left her speechless. She had been thinking of Maximilian as someone who had made terrible mistakes, not as a calculating killer who would eliminate anyone who threatened him. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We have the boy. If you want to see him again, you'll stop investigating your mother's death and disappear from Portland permanently. You have 24 hours to decide. Aurelia's blood turned to ice as she turned to look at the back seat. Orion was gone. The car was still moving. The windows were still closed. There was no way anyone could have taken him without her noticing. Then she realized what had happened. The figure she had seen at the warehouse entrance hadn't been there to search for them. He had been there to take Orion while they were focused on escaping through the back exit. They have my son. Dorian slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the deserted highway. In the sudden silence, Aurelia's panicked breathing was the only sound. That's impossible. Orion was just in the back seat. She turned around again, desperately hoping she had made a mistake. But the back seat was empty except for the small backpack Orion had packed at the warehouse. Dorian, this doesn't make sense. He was sleeping right there 5 minutes ago. Dorian's face had gone pale as he stared at his phone. Aurelia, check the timestamp on that text message. She looked at her phone again. The threatening message had been sent 47 minutes ago, while they were still at the warehouse preparing to leave. They took him before we ever left the building. The realization hit her like a physical blow. While she had been in the loft waking Orion, someone else had been there. The person she had helped dress and gather belongings hadn't been her son. How is that possible? I talked to him. He responded to me. Trauma can cause hallucinations, especially when someone is under extreme stress. Your mind created what you needed to see to function during the escape. Aurelia's hands shook as she called the number that had sent the threat. I want to talk to my son. Mrs. Thornwick, how lovely to hear from you. Maximilian's voice was calm and pleasant, as if they were having a normal conversation. Orion is perfectly safe, and he'll remain that way as long as you make the right choices. Let me talk to him. Of course. There was a rustling sound. Then Orion's scared but steady voice came through the phone. Mom? I'm okay, but I don't understand what's happening. Maximilian says we're playing a game, but it doesn't feel like a game. Baby, listen to me carefully. Do exactly what Maximilian tells you to do, and everything will be fine. I'm coming to get you. I love you, Mom. I love you too. Maximilian's voice returned. As you can hear, he's unharmed. Let's keep it that way. I assume you're with Dorian Ravencrest. Aurelia looked at Dorian, who was already making urgent phone calls to people she couldn't identify. Yes. Excellent. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to convince Mr. Ravencrest to abandon whatever revenge fantasy he's been pursuing for the last 10 years. You're both going to leave Portland permanently and never speak about your mother's death again. In exchange, Orion will be returned to you safely. And if we refuse, then Orion will share his grandmother's fate. I've spent 10 years building an empire, Aurelia. I won't let it be destroyed by a dead woman's daughter and her delusional boyfriend. The call ended, leaving Aurelia staring at her phone in horror. He's going to kill Orion. Dorian finished his call and turned to her with an expression that was both determined and dangerous. No, he's not. I know where Maximilian would take him. How could you possibly know that? Because I've been watching him for 10 years. He has a private estate outside the city that he uses for meetings he doesn't want recorded or witnessed. It's isolated, heavily secured, and completely off the official records. Then how do we get Orion out? Very carefully. But first, we need to get to that storage unit and retrieve your mother's evidence. It's the only thing that will destroy Maximilian permanently. Aurelia wanted to scream that they didn't have time for gathering evidence when her son was in immediate danger, but she forced herself to think logically. Even if they managed to rescue Orion tonight, Maximilian would never stop hunting them unless they could prove his crimes and have him arrested. The storage facility was a sprawling complex of identical metal buildings on the outskirts of Portland. Dorian's contact met them at the gate with master keys and a promise to erase any record of their visit. Unit 247 was larger than Aurelia had expected, filled with carefully wrapped paintings, file cabinets, and storage boxes labeled in her mother's precise handwriting. But what immediately caught her attention was a modern safe hidden behind a false wall panel. She was more paranoid than I realized. Dorian muttered as he examined the safe's digital lock. "Try my birthday." The lock clicked open on the first attempt, revealing stacks of documents, computer drives, and audio recording equipment. Aurelia pulled out a thick folder labeled Maximilian, Criminal Evidence, and opened it to find copies of forged authentication certificates, bank records showing payments for fraudulent appraisals, and correspondence between Maximilian and various art dealers discussing the sale of fake pieces. But the most damning evidence was a collection of audio recordings that Valentina had made during her final weeks alive. Dorian connected one of the digital recorders to a portable speaker, and Maximilian's voice filled the storage unit. "Valentina, you're being unreasonably cautious about these authentications. Our clients are paying premium fees for quick turnarounds, not academic research projects. Quick turnarounds that compromise accuracy are fraudulent, Max. I won't sign certificates for pieces I haven't properly examined. You're being naive about how the art market actually works. Everyone cuts corners. We're just being more honest about it. I'm not signing fake certificates." End of discussion. The next recording was more heated. "If you don't cooperate with our expanded authentication schedule, I'll have to reconsider our business relationship." What does that mean? It means I'll find experts who understand the commercial realities of this industry. Your reputation won't protect you if you become a liability to my clients. The final recording was chilling in its casual brutality. "You've become a problem, Valentina. Problems need to be solved. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you that your services will no longer be required. Permanently." Aurelia sank onto a storage box, overwhelmed by the evidence of Maximilian's calculated evil. The man who had raised her, who had pretended to love her, had murdered her mother for money and then spent 10 years lying to her about it. "There's enough evidence here to put him in prison for life," Dorian said quietly. "But first, we need to get Orion back." They loaded the most important documents and recordings into Dorian's car, then drove toward the remote estate where Maximilian was holding her son. As they approached the property, Dorian's phone rang. "Sir, it's Marcus. We've confirmed the location and established surveillance. The subject has minimal security, probably because he doesn't expect you to find him this quickly. How many men does he have?" 3, plus himself. "But sir, there's something else. We've identified 2 other vehicles on the property that suggest he's planning to leave the country tonight. He's running." Aurelia felt a surge of panic. If he's planning to disappear, what happens to Orion? Dorian's expression became grim. "He won't leave witnesses behind." They parked half a mile from the estate and approached on foot through dense forest. The property was a converted farmhouse surrounded by open fields that would make a direct approach impossible without being detected. "How do we get inside without getting Orion killed?" "We don't break in. We get invited." Dorian pulled out his phone and called Maximilian directly. "It's over, Max. I have all of Valentina's evidence, and I'm turning it over to the FBI in the morning. But I'm willing to make a trade." "What kind of trade?" "Orion's safety for a head start. Give me the boy, and I'll delay contacting the authorities for 24 hours. That should give you enough time to disappear." "And why would I trust you?" "Because you don't have a choice. I know where you are. I know you're planning to run tonight. And I know you're smart enough to realize that killing a child will bring more attention than you can handle." There was a long pause before Maximilian responded. "Come to the front door?" "Alone. Any sign of backup, and the boy dies. Dorian ended the call and turned to Aurelia. Stay here until I give you the signal. What signal? You'll know. She watched him walk across the open field toward the farmhouse, completely exposed and vulnerable. Every instinct screamed at her to run after him, but she forced herself to wait. The front door opened when Dorian was still 50 yards away. Maximilian stepped out onto the porch, holding Orion in front of him like a human shield. Even from a distance, Aurelia could see the gun pressed against her son's head. That's close enough, Dorian. You always were too trusting for your own good. Let the boy go, Max. This is between us. No, this is about protecting what I've built. Valentina thought she could destroy me with her moral superiority, and you think you can finish what she started. But I've spent 10 years preparing for this day. Preparing how? Maximilian smiled, and Aurelia felt her blood turn to ice. By ensuring that if I can't have my empire, no one else can have what they love either. The gunshot echoed across the fields, but it wasn't Maximilian who fired. Marcus Webb stepped out from behind a barn with a rifle, and Maximilian collapsed onto the porch. Orion ran toward Dorian, who swept him up and carried him away from the house. Aurelia sprinted across the field, reaching them just as police cars began arriving with sirens wailing. Is he dead? She asked, looking toward the motionless figure on the porch. No, Marcus replied, but he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. As FBI agents secured the scene and paramedics treated Maximilian's wound, Aurelia held Orion tightly while Dorian turned over all of Valentina's evidence to the authorities. What happens now? She asked. Now Maximilian faces justice for your mother's murder, and dozens of art collectors get their money back for fraudulent pieces. The nightmare is finally over. 3 months later, Aurelia stood in the same warehouse where this had all begun, but now it looked completely different. Dorian had converted it into a combination art restoration studio and authentication laboratory, complete with the same specialized equipment her mother had used. Are you sure about this partnership? She asked, reviewing the business documents that would make her Dorian's equal partner in rebuilding Valentina's authentication company. Your mother would be proud of what we're creating together. Art authentication with absolute integrity, exactly as she envisioned it. Orion ran through the studio, chasing a soccer ball and filling the space with the kind of joy that had been missing from their lives for too long. And us? Aurelia asked quietly. Are you sure about that too? Dorian pulled her into his arms, and she felt the same sense of coming home that she had experienced the first night they spent in this space. I spent 10 years waiting for justice for your mother. I don't want to spend another day waiting to build a life with you. Outside, Portland's evening light filtered through the industrial windows, casting long shadows across the restored paintings that lined the walls. But inside, Aurelia finally felt like she had found her way back to the future her mother had wanted for her. A future built on truth, love, and the unshakable foundation of justice finally served. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn morning in Portland, Aurelia Thornwick Ravencrest stood before a bronze plaque mounted outside the renovated warehouse that now housed the Valentina Thornwick Center for Art Authentication. The inscription read, "In memory of Dr. Valentina Thornwick, whose dedication to truth and integrity in art authentication continues to inspire a new generation of scholars and investigators." Mom, are you coming? Orion called from the entrance, where he was holding the door open for a group of graduate students arriving for their morning seminar on historical pigment analysis. At 8 years old, Orion had become the unofficial mascot of the Authentication Center, charming visiting collectors and researchers with his precocious questions about Renaissance painting techniques and his uncanny ability to spot inconsistencies in brushwork that trained experts sometimes missed. Just a minute, sweetheart. Aurelia touched the plaque gently, thinking about how much had changed since that desperate night when she had sent a text message to the wrong number. The Thornwick Center was now the most respected art authentication facility on the West Coast, with a waiting list of clients that stretched 6 months into the future. More importantly, they had restored the integrity that Maximilian's crimes had stolen from the industry. 17 major museums had used their services to identify and remove forged pieces from their collections, and 43 art collectors had received financial settlements for fraudulent works they had unknowingly purchased through Maximilian's network. The morning news crew just called, Dorian said, joining her outside the building. They want to interview us about Maximilian's sentencing today. 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. It's finally over. Dorian wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, watching Oregon's autumn leaves drift past the center's windows. Not over. Beginning. We're building something your mother only dreamed of. Through the glass doors, Aurelia could see the bustling activity of the authentication lab. Dr. Sarah Chun, Valentina's former research assistant who had joined their team 6 months ago, was training a new group of graduate students in spectroscopic analysis. Marcus Webb, who had transitioned from security work to business management, was reviewing acquisition proposals for the center's growing collection of comparative samples. But what made Aurelia happiest was the knowledge that Orion was growing up in an environment where truth mattered more than profit, where questions were encouraged rather than suppressed, and where the past was honored while building toward the future. Mrs. Ravencrest? A young woman approached them hesitantly. I'm Jessica Martinez from the University of Washington. I'm starting my master's thesis on authentication fraud in the Pacific Northwest art market, and I was hoping to interview you about your mother's work. Aurelia smiled, remembering her own hunger for knowledge at that age. Of course, but please call me Aurelia, and let me introduce you to my husband and business partner, Dorian. As they walked into the center together, Aurelia caught sight of the portrait that hung in the main laboratory. It was the last painting her mother had been working on before her death, a damaged 18th century landscape that Aurelia had finally been able to restore using techniques she had learned from studying Valentina's notes. But the portrait wasn't just technically restored. It had been transformed into something more beautiful than it had ever been originally, with subtle enhancements that honored the artist's intent while correcting flaws that age and poor conservation had created. Like their lives, Aurelia thought. The damage inflicted by Maximilian's lies and crimes had been repaired, but they hadn't simply returned to their original state. They had become something stronger, more purposeful, more beautiful than what had existed before. Are you happy? Dorian asked quietly as they watched Orion explain the difference between authentic and reproduction canvas weaves to a group of fascinated college students. I'm more than happy. I'm home. Outside, Portland's afternoon light painted golden rectangles across the polished floors of the Valentina Thornwick Center for Art Authentication, where truth had finally triumphed over deception, where love had conquered fear, and where a family torn apart by violence had been reborn into something unbreakable. In her private office, Aurelia kept the last letter her mother had written, discovered among the evidence in the storage unit. It was addressed to her, but had never been sent, dated the day before Valentina's death. My dearest Aurelia, if you're reading this, it means I wasn't able to protect you from the truth about Maximilian. But I hope it also means that you've found the strength to seek justice, not just for me, but for everyone whose trust he violated. Remember that art endures because people like us refuse to let beauty be corrupted by greed. Build something worthy of the truth. Love without fear. And know that I am proud of the woman you've become. All my love, Mom. As evening fell over Portland, Aurelia locked the letter away and walked hand in hand with her husband toward the home where their son was waiting with homework questions and stories about his day. They had built something worthy of the truth. They had loved without fear. And somewhere, she knew, Valentina was proud of the life they had created from the ashes of her death. The nightmare was over. The dream had just begun.